Hey there, folks. Here is our lecture over the beginning of the French Revolution, the causes, and the early revolution. Pre-revolutionary France was still very much under the old regime. So this feudalism, these systems of social hierarchy and inequality that ruled in the Middle Ages, while they had dissipated in England and a lot of other Western European countries, they were still very much prevalent in France at the time. Society was divided into three estates that ruled the social hierarchy. The first estate was made up of the clergy. This was made up of about 130,000 people, excuse me, which is a very small percentage of the population. And they were exempt from the tile. That's not how you would say it in French, but that's how I'm going to say it. The tile was a land tax. This was France's primary tax. And because the land that the church owned was not getting taxed, that meant that that was a great deal of money that France was not receiving because the church owned a great deal of land. The second estate was made up of the nobility or the aristocracy. This was comprised of about 350,000 people, again, a pretty small percentage of the population. They held a lot of leading positions in society and the government, but they wanted to grow their power. The aristocracy resented how much power the monarchy, the royals, had. And the second estate was also exempt from almost all taxes. So while they had the most amount of wealth in the country, they did not pay most taxes. The third estate was made up of the commoners, and this was about 98% of the French population. So the third estate is divided into three major groups. The bourgeoisie, that is how you pronounce that word, bourgeoisie. Do not say bourgeois on our call, or I will fire you. So the bourgeoisie was the highest educated and highest paid of the three groups in the third estate. These were educated merchants, artisans, college educated, upper middle class. City workers were people in the cities who had low wages and were often starving, and then the peasants are the third group. These are rural workers who worked out in the country or owned farmlands. And they made up about 80% of the population, and they paid most of the taxes because they were the only landowners who had to pay the tile. So as I've mentioned previously, the Enlightenment had a tremendous effect on the French Revolution. Firstly, because the political ideas of equality and natural rights to life, liberty, and property were very attractive to the bourgeoisie. Because the bourgeoisie wanted the monarchy's power to be broken up and redistributed. They wanted a social system that was based on economic achievement rather than on birthright. So the people who had the most power in French society at the time were the royals and the aristocrats. And now these middle and upper middle class merchants and artisans and educated people, they wanted social power, but were unable to get it because they were not born into social power. So, some other problems that were facing the monarchy that led directly to the French Revolution, there were bad harvests in the years leading up to 1789. And this led to food shortages. Because there were food shortages, the price of food and goods skyrocketed, and because the price of food and goods skyrocketed, unemployment in the cities skyrocketed because people could not afford to pay bread and to buy bread, and therefore could not afford to pay employees, etc., etc. So poverty, because of this, grew, reaching as high as a third of the population who were impoverished. That's not a third of the population unemployed. That's a third of the population in poverty. Um, Also, government spending on wars and extravagant palaces like Versailles had led to a financial crisis. France's finances were on the brink of collapse. So Louis XVI was put in a position where he had to address these problems. He had to address the growing unrest in the bourgeoisie. He had to address the starvation and poverty that was widespread across France and the financial crisis that was just around the corner. So, how did he do this? Well, excuse me. he called to order the Estates General. The Estates General is the French Parliament. Remember, Parliament is a lawmaking body. And the Estates General had not met for about 150 years, since 1614. The Estates General had representatives from all three estates. So remember, first estate clergy, second estate nobility, third estate commoners. So the government decided the third estate should get double representation because it made up most of the population. So the initial representation was first estate 300, second estate 300, third estate 600. Seems fair, right? But this is not representative of the makeup of the French population, because remember, the third estate makes up 98% of the population, but here they're only getting double representation. It's a painting of the Estates General. So the third estate said, this is not fair. We do not want the Estates General run by the king. Instead, we want a constitutional government. So remember, this is very, very much influenced by the ideas of John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Montesquieu, who studied governments and found that constitutional republics were the ideal. They also said that they wanted to abolish tax exemptions. The third estate said, listen, we have two of our estates who have the most money and the most land who are not paying taxes on any of that income or that land. And therefore, the economy is resting on the back of its middle class and its poorest citizens. So, of course, it's in a state of financial destitution. So, in addition to that, there was a dispute over representation. So the first and second estates thought that each estate should get one vote, whereas the third estate thought that each person should get one vote. Normally, if we were in class, I would say, why do you think this is? But since we're not in class, this is pretty obvious, right? The third estate wants each person to get a vote because the third estate has the most number of people. They represent 98% of the population. Whereas the first and second estates want each estate to get one vote because they want to have more power. So, of course, the king sides with the first and second estates, and he threatens to dissolve the Estates General if the third estate does not fall in line. Well, the third estate doesn't fall in line. So they basically say, kiss off, King Louis, we're going to form the National Assembly. So they break off, they begin to draft a French constitution, and they make what's called the Tennis Court Oath because they were kicked out of the Estates General building, and so they had to go to a tennis court next door, and they made an oath there that they would continue to meet until they had a French constitution to establish a French republic. So, meanwhile, while this is all going on, rumors are spreading that there's going to be an attack on the third estate by the king's forces and or foreign invaders who want to help reinforce the king's power. So, because of this, commoners stormed and dismantled the Bastille on July 14th, 1789. In France, Bastille Day, July 14th, is kind of like our July 4th. It's their Independence Day. The Bastille was a massive prison and royal armory. An armory is where you keep weapons and materials for armies. So they basically took over the biggest prison in the city and forcefully seized all of the king's materials to arm his military. So with this, the king's authority collapsed almost overnight. Here is a dramatization of the storming of the Bastille. So, after the storming of the Bastille, local revolutions started to break out all over France as common people struggled with people in power to basically forcefully take control. Peasant rebellions broke out all over the countryside, and people started to form militias, which are small, informal armies, because they were terrified of invasion by foreign countries who were invading in support of the monarchy. And this fear was not unfounded because there were many countries nearby who were genuinely anxious that their people would see the revolution in France and decide to violently overthrow their monarchy. And remember, they're looking at this with the context of not only the French Revolution, but also the American Revolution, which was successful just 10 years earlier. So at this point, within a span of 13 years, 1776, 1789, yeah, with a span of over a span of 13 years, um, these are two countries that have successfully overthrown fairly powerful monarchies. And while America overthrew the British, where they had an ocean between them, the French Revolution took place in France. So other European monarchs are kind of starting to sweat and are getting a little nervous about the ideas that this is going to put in their citizens' heads. But we will talk about that later when we get to Napoleon and the Reign of Terror. Not in that order. All right. So the National Assembly, after the storming of the Bastille, the king and queen flee Paris, and the National Assembly, which is made up of the Third Estate, start to take over. So the first thing they do is they remove tax exemptions. Now, aristocrats and clergy are expected to pay taxes so that they can try to basically fix the economic crisis that is happening because of the monarchy's spending. They also removed all leftover traits of the feudal system. So they got rid of protections for landlords, things like that, that were still enforcing the strict social hierarchy in France and limiting the power of the Third Estate, especially those peasant workers and the poorest members of the Third Estate. And then last, they seized church lands. So the National Assembly decided that the church needed to be reformed. So they made it so that church officials had to be elected by the National Assembly. And they did this to prevent nepotism and to prevent power from being kept in aristocratic families and things like that, because the church, they believed, had too much power. Again, you're seeing here the influence of Voltaire, separation of church and state. Although in this case, the National Assembly is forcefully reforming the church. They adopted a document as a temporary constitution called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. In this document, they specified equal rights for men and access to public office based on talent. So basically, they believe that you should be able to gain power based on your own merit. You might remember that we studied one of the dynasties that established this in their bureaucracy back in ancient China. And so that means basically, if you are skilled, you should be able to earn your position. It's not based on wealth or birthright. They believe the Declaration of Rights of Man and the Citizen enabled all citizens to have the right to take part in the legislative process, meaning voting, and all citizens were guaranteed freedom of speech and freedom of the press. All right, so we see here Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI, who were king and queen of France at the time of the French Revolution. Marie Antoinette is actually the daughter of one of the enlightened despots we studied, Maria Therese of Austria. So the death of the monarchy. So Louis XVI, this is a metaphorical and literal death. Louis XVI and his wife attempted to flee from Paris, and they did flee. But in August, a group of, actually, it's a group of French women, found Louis XVI and dragged him back to Paris to stand trial. So they got the National Assembly to suspend the monarchy. So to say, they got them to abolish the monarchy, to say there is no longer a king or queen of France. And then they called for a national convention. At that convention, and we'll talk more about this in the Reign of Terror PowerPoint, at that convention, they voted and decided to execute the king, and soon after, the Reign of Terror, took over France. So September 21st, the National Convention abolishes the monarchy and makes France officially a republic. January 21st, the next year, 1793, Louis XVI is executed, and October 16th, 1793, Marie Antoinette is executed, as well as some of their children. And here we have a drawing of Madame Guillotine, which we are going to see a lot of in our next PowerPoint, the Reign of Terror. So you can see here the long-term causes of the French Revolution. Under political, we have absolute monarchy. Both aristocrats and the bourgeoisie were tired of the monarchy's absolute power and wanted it to be dissolved and redistributed. However, they wanted that to be done in different ways. Um, Social causes, number one, the growth of industry and the rise of the middle class. The middle class started to grow more powerful, but they found that there was a limit to their power because of the aristocracy and the issue of nepotism and birthright. Growing burden of feudal dues. So again, this is feudalism was creating this huge social burden and economic burden on peasants and the people who were also paying most of the country's taxes. And of course, increasing poverty. Remember, increasing poverty, um, bad crops leads to food shortages, leads to a rising price of food, leads to poverty and mass employment. Economic causes, we have the massive government debt from waging wars as well as extravagant spending on things like Versailles. Um, there was an attempt to tax the nobles, which the nobles did not like, which made them more likely to support insurrection against the king and queen. Of course, that turned around to bite the nobles in the butt when it came to the Reign of Terror. And the massive tax burden on the Third Estate. The Third Estate was paying almost all of the taxes in pre revolutionary France, and it was totally disproportionate to who held the most wealth. Intellectual, of course, we have the growth of new ideas that are coming from the Age of Enlightenment, the idea of natural rights, the idea of separation of church and state, checks and balances, constitutional republics, etc., etc. And then, of course, we have the influence of the American Revolution. The American Revolution was a direct inspiration for the French Revolution. In fact, many American revolutionaries had promised support when France went back and led their own revolution, but that did not happen. So that is the beginning of the French Revolution. Next week, when we get to the Reign of Terror, it's going to get a lot bloodier. And that's going to be kind of more the French Revolution as you understand it. So when people talk about the French Revolution, usually they are talking about a 1 year period known as the Reign of Terror. Oh, my browser closed. And the Reign of Terror is that period where it is, mass suspicion, people being executed in droves, things like that. So when we start talking about the Reign of Terror next week, that's the really, I think this part is fun, but that's the part that usually my students are the most interested in. All right, so this week you have some causes of the revolution DBQs you need to answer, as well as a short response. And so make sure you get those done. If you have questions or you need me to walk you through the DBQs, please email me. I'm happy to sit on a Zoom call and help you through that assignment. Okay, I will see y'all later. Bye.